This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything. Oh, yeah.
Welcome to special edition episode 36 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, December 29th, 2016. My name is Bryce and thank you for joining me. What you're about to listen to is part 2 of my interview/discussion with Cody, the mycologist who we had on last week to discuss the history of entheogen use in religious cults. And, well, we're going to talk about how that may have played into Joseph Smith. It's a burgeoning theory, and I feel like it needs to be discussed more. Whether it's right or wrong, it needs to be in the public sphere, and we need to discuss it. So, without further ado, this is part 2 of my discussion with Cody. Alright, I am joined here once again by Cody Noconi to talk about entheogen use and its possible effect on Mormonism. Of course, if you listen back to the first part of this episode, last week's, you'll get a very, very cursory knowledge of some of the history of entheogen use and essentially its influence on alchemy and Hermeticism and the birth of chemistry and sciences. And what we're talking about here is such a vast body of knowledge, and there's no way to approach this from our 21st century mentality without it engaging skepticism and throwing up red flags. And that is good. I really, really like red flags. I like to stop, take a second, and say, this doesn't make sense. I need sources. I need more information here. And that is what we are doing this episode. Hopefully, some of you have had your skeptic radar pinging, and you're questioning some of the stuff that we talked about in episode 1. And there are a lot of sources in the show links there. But now we're going to talk about something even more controversial, and of course that is the possible influence on Mormonism. Now, why this is controversial is it's a field of study that doesn't have a whole lot of people backing it. It's a very new field of study, mycology in general, and the effects of it on religion. I guess there's a fair amount of body of knowledge there, but on Mormonism specifically, there's very few people who would claim that hallucinogens are responsible for the genesis of Mormonism, essentially. Or had any hand in it, or played any part in the religion. But if this is a theory that offers explanatory power, we need to put it on the table, we need to talk about it, we need to discuss it, and that's why I have somebody who knows much more about this than I do. So, Cody, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Bryce.
Absolutely. Of course, we skimmed over so much. It's been a whole 8 minutes since we turned off the record button, and as soon as we hit stop, we're like, oh, we forgot to talk about this and this, and our entire conversation was exasperated frustration about how many things we didn't talk about, and, things that we just skimmed over that require an hour or two of discussion in and of themselves, but Unfortunately, that's the nature of the podcast, and that's why we're just introducing you guys to this knowledge to hopefully elicit a little bit of study from yourselves. Look this up. Check our discussion. Check our facts.
I love it. I challenge the audience to please help us flesh this out, because this is one of the few areas of Mormonism that is yet to really be dealt with and really, really looked at closely.
Because it's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a prophet who's just tripping balls all the time, and, well, I mean, that's a vast overgeneralization, but if you have a prophet who came up with his book because he was tripping, or, with the help of mushrooms, it really kind of puts a stick in the divine authority claims of this church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, personally, myself, I want to explain the genesis of the Book of Mormon by any naturalistic means necessary. As a person who studies history, we don't have access to saying God did it. No historian can legitimately claim that this happened because God did it, because historians don't have access to God. They have access to naturalistic explanations. And if Joseph Smith came up with a miraculous book, and he was somehow able to elicit amazing visionary experiences in his parishioners, we can't say God did it, because historians and scholars do not have access to that answer. So we have to explain it with naturalistic means. And this is one of those possible means. This is one possible way that this was done. Now, I want to jump into the discussion about Mormonism pretty deeply here, because that's where it's relevant to the show and why we did the previous episode, why we established our body of knowledge, so we can take this time to talk about specifically Mormonism. Can we trace back, of course, last time we talked a little bit about Hiram Smith and, Joseph Smith being connected. How early can we trace back to saying that this may have had an impact on Joseph Smith's life?
I believe, well, it's hard to pin down an exact date for entheogen use. The discussion has to start with his magical career, because that's what introduced him to all of this in the first place.
Okay, great place to start.
It's pretty easy to pin down somewhere between 1820 and 1822 is when we know he was acting as a treasure seer, or a digger, but it was somewhere between 1820 and 1822 that he began to really pick up the more esoteric aspects of this knowledge, and that he started to perform his own ceremonial magic. And
well, he was 15, 16 years old at the time. That's kind of a stage that a lot of people go through at that time in their life. They're trying to find their own mold, find out who they are.
This is also the time where he meets his first mentor, his first magical mentor in Lumen Walters, who I think imparted a lot of this information to him. And based on Lumen Walters' career and where he ended up in life and what he was known for, it's pretty easy to speculate what it was he taught Joseph.
Okay, let's talk about Lumen Walters, because I have very, very briefly touched on him in the show way, way back before the Book of Mormon was essentially published. The time that I remember talking about him was when we were talking about Joseph Smith and the Book of Pukei. That was published by Abner Cole, who was working out of the basement of the Palmyra printing press, the E.B. Grandin printing press. And he found manuscript copies of the Book of Mormon and began publishing the first few chapters of it until Joe and Hiram showed up and told him to fuck off. But Abner Cole's talked about Lumen Walters being this mentor or this mystic that came to teach Joseph Smith. And this would have happened in the early to mid-20s, 1820s, right?
Yep. We think it depends on who is telling the story, but I think it's closer to the 1822 timeline, part of the timeline, that Lumen comes in, or at least he starts associating with Smith and kind of taking him under his wing.
Okay, who is this guy?
Lumen Walters, I haven't been able to verify it, but as far as I can tell, he's a distant cousin of Emma Hale.
Really?
And that's how the Hales were involved with the treasure digging group. As far as I'm aware, their connection to the Smiths is lumen.
Interesting, because I wasn't aware that the Hales did any treasure digging with Joe. I thought they considered him
they allowed
batshit
treasure
crazy.
digging around their property and knew about it. So they were at least okay with it, even if it didn't affect them directly.
Right. Okay.
And so what we know about Lumen Walters is that he, at some point, apparently traveled through France and England and kind of returned to the States before this time a self-proclaimed doctor and magician. He was running around as a self-proclaimed medical doctor, administering cures to people. He was a self-proclaimed clairvoyant. He apparently helped people find lost things, which is maybe why he started running around with the treasure diggers.
Interesting.
He apparently had a pretty in-depth knowledge of magic, and he had, as far as we can tell, a pretty broad range of tools. He's described as using stuffed toads, rusty swords, books in Latin. We know he had a pretty sizable library for somebody at that time, and they were books of magic. It's after this time that we start to see Joseph pick up a lot of these practices, and it was Abner Cole actually that suggested that it was Walters who first put the idea of finding a lost record of the Americas into Joseph's head.
Interesting.
And he also suggested that after Lumen Walters left the area, because he basically conned his way out of the community.
Just like Joe did.
Abner Cole makes a statement, something to the effect of Joseph filled the spot that Lumen left when he vacated the area.
I'm going to read a little tiny bit from Lumen Walters' Wikipedia page. Now, this is Wikipedia. Take that for what it is worth. It says, in November of 1819, that's when he married Harriet Howard in Vermont. And then by 1822, he had taken residence in Gorham, Ontario County, New York, which is next door to Joseph Smith.
And when is that?
1822.
1822, there we go.
Yeah, it says by 1822. So from the time he was married in 1819 in Vermont, where Joseph was living until 1816, I think. He was living in Pulteney, Vermont, or in some of the Vermont areas. No, maybe it was like 1812 or 13. But yeah, regardless, in 1822, that's when we have record of Walter living in Ontario County, New York. Right next door to Joe, essentially.
Mm-hmm. There's a few of his neighbors that put him in the area before this time, but there's not a lot of evidence to substantiate any of that. And it is interesting to note that if it is closer to 1822, it's only a year later before Joseph starts receiving his visions of the angel and getting instructions.
Not even that. His first own autobiographical account, the 1832 version, it says in 1822 when he was that's when he had his first experience of God, and the vision of his understanding opened or something to that effect, and he saw God in the heavens. And I'd have to find the exact verbiage, but that's his 1832 account. And then when it was re-recorded by Oliver Cowdery in 1834, he punched it back to 1820 instead of 1822. So, yeah, pretty significant, I would think.
Yep.
Walters, there's this guy, you said he went on a tour, essentially.
It should be noted that France, England, and Germany were the alchemical hubs of the world as far as Western thought was concerned.
Right. It's the Enlightenment. It's post-Enlightenment period. That's where everything is coming out of there.
Mm-hmm. There's one book in particular. There's a few books we'll talk about that are books of magic that were being circulated at the time. One in particular we're going to talk about at some length, in some depth, is Francis Barrett's book, The Magus, or Great Intelligencer. It was published in 1801, and not only was Walters using Enochian ceremonial magic that was brought down by John Dee through this book, because a lot of the books of magic at the time were kind of amalgamations. They weren't just like one school of thought. It was like, here's a mishmash of a bunch of different ways you can do this, and you find what works for you.
Okay, fair enough.
So you weren't just exposed to one school of magic. So it's not a great leap to say that because we know Joseph was exposed to Enochian D magic, that he was also exposed to this and this and this and this. And we'll go into that. Okay. As far as we're concerned with Walters, there is a set of magical tools that kind of came to the surface in the 1970s.
1970s?
1970s.
Okay.
It is a collection of magical items that was apparently owned by Hiram Smith and the Smith family in general. This has been covered by the Tanners, Dan Vogel, Michael Quaid, Lance Owens.
Very reputable Mormon historians.
Yes, and they've gone over the magical collection at some length. The fair Mormon apologist argument is that all of these items were owned by Hiram, so they're not Joseph, so everything's fine.
Which is bullshit.
Which is silly. Because
grade A bullshit.
To suggest that he would not have read or used or shared his brother's material is ridiculous. Well, Dan Vogel and Michael Quinn actually think that it was Joseph's material and that it was just in Hiram's possession because several of the parchments have some the dates they use are in reference to Joseph.
Interesting.
And his astrological table.
Interesting. Well, and I mean, let's just say it's not like Hiram and Joe didn't know each other. They were best friends, essentially. I mean, by the time the reorganization of the church happens in 1838, early 1838 in Far West, Hiram Smith becomes Joseph's second counselor with Sidney Rigdon as his first counselor. When Joe had the operation on his leg, Hiram Smith, his next older brother, was the one who was termed, or, tasked with carrying Joseph around and, making sure that Joe didn't feel left out from the other boys because he had the bum leg. And, they were inseparable brothers, and they were shot and died together in the same room.
Exactly.
They were very close. To imply that only one of them was practicing magic is, I think, absolutely absurd.
Also important to note, Hiram was inducted into the Freemason ceremonies somewhere between 1823 and 1827. So before the Book of Mormon was published, not only was he practicing ceremonial magic from these esoteric magicians in France and England, but he was also practicing Freemason magic that has heavy ergot and mushroom symbolism through some of the ceremonial rites.
Interesting.
So not only was he introduced to this through Francis Barrett, but also through the Freemasonry, which Joseph later joined himself.
Right.
They established a lodge in Nauvoo, I think.
Yeah. That's when Joe rose to the third degree because it was the Scottish rite.
The Scottish rite is, out of all of the Masonic schools, the Scottish Freemasonry has probably got the most heavy symbolism in it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we could go over that again.
Yes, we need to go into that.
We were forced to kind of move forward for the sake of our timeline.
But it's pertinent because that's the chapter that Joe joined.
It'll come back in just a minute. We're back in 1822, 1823 area where he meets Lumen. Mm-hmm. The collection of magic items that the Smith family had, there are 3 parchments that are full of ceremonial magic and how to perform them, essentially. They're like how-to manuals for certain spells.
And you showed me pictures of these, right?
Yeah, we have pictures of all 3 of them. We know what they contain and what symbolism they use. All of the symbolism used in these parchments can be found in Francis Barrett's The Magus or Central Intelligencer.
Interesting.
So a lot of the angels that he was trying to summon via these magic scrolls are directly copied from Francis Barrett's book. It can also be found in about a half a dozen other books that were circulating at the time. For example, like Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, which was published in 1584, and Ebenezer Sibley's A New and Complete Illustration of Occult Sciences, which was published in 1795 in London.
So, and anybody who was anybody, essentially studying alchemy, studying these occult practices, or whatever version of them, like you said, is like, here's a whole bunch of methods, try yours, find out what works for you. But like, if anybody who was studying these things, they would have read these books.
Exactly.
Right? These were widely public. Very many copies were published.
Well, even
Lumen Walters probably consumed these.
Mm-hmm. Even parts of the books were being published. These were being published in manuscript form. There were little pamphlets being circulated all over the place for a lot cheaper, and so these were like intellectual contagions. You could give one member of the Smith family one, and within weeks the whole family had read them, and then you return it to the person that owned it originally, and now there's no evidence that you got that information from anywhere.
Of course.
So this is all very hard to track down, and it forces us to speculate on some level.
Well, and because we don't have a library from Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
We don't have, the Smith family bookshelf that had their Bible and the late war, and we don't have these books. We don't know where to find any of them. There's no way to say whether or not they actually had these.
But when we do find 3 magic scrolls full of material you can only find from these sources, it's not a great leap to say he probably at least had exposure to these materials.
Well, and these things were recovered from the Smith family, from Hiram Smith, from what I understand. After his death, probably? And they were absorbed into the Smith family?
I believe they were handed down as family heirlooms, and then sometime in the late 70s, they were either released or it's hard to track down exactly who had these and what happened. It was it was actually a TBM BYU. I think he was a BYU professor that presented all of this, and he got in trouble for it. Actually,
imagine that.
I'll have to find the article on that. Anyway,
but the point I was getting at is like we're talking 1822, 23 when they would have been reading this stuff, and he had it with him till he died. Hiram did, or Joseph did, whoever. Obviously, these were important to them.
One of the magic items, the Jupiter talisman, Joseph did have on him. It was on his person when he was shot to death, and that again, a formula for how to create your own magic talismans, including the exact one he was wearing, is found in Francis Barrett's book.
So, show me some of these pictures. We have to describe them to the listeners. I don't know if they're on your tablet or on your phone, but there are some really, really impressive pictures of these manuscripts that you're talking about here, Cody. And I want to describe them to the listeners so we can know what exactly we're talking about. So,
and this picture of the knife, again, is the ceremonial knife that you find in the magical collection as well.
And Hiram had one of these knives.
So this particular page is important because it shows a lot of the majority of the symbolism you find on the Holiness to the Lord parchment. That's the name of the parchment. This particular page has almost all of the symbolism you find on that parchment. And you get it all from one page, essentially. So he just had to see this book and look at it once.
And copy it or whatever, so let me describe what we have here. The top of it, there will be a link for this in the show notes, but for those who don't want to go chase it down, the title of this is Science, Characters, and a Magical Knife. And the top left of this screen is this, or the top left of the page is this big square, ritual thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's a square with a circle in it, with a square inside that, with a square inside that, and, tetragrammatons and crosses and all kinds of stuff all over it. And then we have Omega.
A tetragrammatron is a name of God. It's used as a protection symbol in some of these magical rites.
And it looks like essentially like the 5-pointed star that you draw as a little kid. Doink, 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 doink. Yeah, it looks like that with an extra little growth on the bottom of it, but it says tetragrammatron on it. Tetragrammaton on it. So that sigil is on here as well. And then on the right side, we have 2 circular sigils. And if anybody has seen the picture of the Anthon transcript, quite clearly, this is one of the sigils that Mark Hoffman used in order to create the Anthon transcript. Very, very... It's simple. That's exactly what this is.
And those are called seals of the earth. So again, if you look at the parchment holiness to the Lord, you have a bunch of protection symbols on the outside and in kind of concentric circles. And then the center emblem of that parchment is a way of drawing down the angel Raphael. So you're basically creating a circle of protection so that nothing can get in, no evil spirits can mess up your magic, and then you're drawing down the archangel or the angel Raphael. So just to reemphasize, because a lot of Mormon historians like to paint this as some type of like satanic magical practice. Joseph was practicing white magic. He was drawing down angels. He was doing it for lucrative means. He was trying to use these guys to help him in his treasure digging.
Right.
But he wasn't summoning demons. This is not like Aleister Crowley level shit.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that's only a matter of perspective.
It is.
Right? Because, I mean, if any Mormon looking at these sigils and stuff, they would say, that looks satanic because they're ignorant, right?
But it's worth mentioning at least.
There was a very sharp distinction in Joseph's mind, whether he was using white or black magic. So, of course, on this paper, above and below all of these various symbols and sigils, there are labels for each of them. So the circular sigils that are next to the knife on the right side of the screen, it says, whosoever beareth this sign, all spirits will do him homage. And then the sigil under that is, whosoever beareth this sign need fear no foe. And then below that we have the 2 seals of the earth without which no spirit will appear. And then on the knife itself, it has this on the other side.
That's another name of God.
That's another name of God. And then written on the knife itself, a ceremonial knife. The handle has inscriptions on it. On the blade, it says AGLA, Agla.
And the actual knife that the Smiths own says Adonai, which is a name of God.
Yeah.
And it also has a stamp for... the reason why they think it's Joseph's is because that knife has a seal for Mars, which was his astrological symbol.
Oh, shit, really?
So that knife was very likely his.
Okay.
But it was in Hiram's possession, so none of this matters.
Right.
Remember that, too.
So that's a very brief description of the spell book we're looking at, but of course there will be a link in the show notes for that page, and it'll just be like, I don't know what to title it exactly. It's just the spell book title. Look at the show notes for that picture, because it's really illustrative of some incredible shit. This is a good picture
what
here.
We should talk about, too, is the Jupiter talisman.
Yes.
The thing that he kept on his person until his death.
Yes.
This is a way of keeping in contact with the angelic being that is represented by the planet Jupiter. So there's a lot of characteristics astrologically that Jupiter represents that Joseph would have found favorable and would have wanted to express within himself. And one way to do this magically is to carry around a talisman of Jupiter.
Okay. Which, and let me describe it real quick. It's a circle, 3 concentric circles, and then a square in the middle with a series of numbers. And then on the outer ring of this sigil or seal of Jupiter, there are various symbols. I can't see if they're actually. It's too choppy to see.
These are in Hebrew. And
Hebrew. Okay.
On the back side of it, this is the symbol for Jupiter that it was given. That was brought down through D. So this is again another example of John D magic.
Okay.
This is the astrological symbol for Jupiter.
That really looks like the character manuscript 4. Have you seen that?
Oh, we'll get into character manuscripts later.
Okay.
There's an entire alphabet of alchemical and magical that we see it pop up again and again.
Oh, that's fantastic. So yeah, and this is the seal of Jupiter. This is the talisman that Joseph had on his person when he was shot.
Yes.
And it was recovered from Eliza Snow, if I recall correctly.
That is not. I'm having trouble finding down the sources for that. I believe, from what I understand, the Jupiter talisman came through Emma Smith. She gave it to her husband, her next husband, Bideman.
Yeah.
And it came to us through his line. It was passed down as a family heirloom through him.
Oh, okay.
And she apparently said that it was one of his most treasured possessions and that he had it on his person at the time of his death. So that's how we link it to Joseph.
This seems a little more legit coming from Emma than it does Eliza Snow. And just my personal perspective of who Eliza Snow was.
Yeah. And Eliza Snow was Joseph's magic girlfriend. She was the one that kind of shared his love for this type of stuff. This is the knife.
Oh, no shit.
You can see Adam.
Wow.
It's hard to see.
Yeah, it is.
But
that's kind of a, it looks like a 1970s kind of grainy photo. This will be in the show notes as well, but this is the actual knife that Hiram had on him in his collection. And yeah, it says Adonai on it. And it's hard to see, but there's a little
symbol above it. That's the symbol for Mars.
For Mars. Interesting. So that will be in the link as well.
And interesting as well is astrologically, a conjunction of Mars and Jupiter creates a very interesting and charismatic character that is Joseph in a box. So
really? Well, interesting. Good old astrology is
well, and he was
it's a thing.
Very, very into astrology and how the planets worked.
And it was his good luck stuff. It was what he was doing for occult good luck rituals, or to summon good spirits, or whatever the case was. I mean, these things that we're seeing in here, they were practiced by Joe. These things were used by Joe. We see them in the character's manuscript. Unequivocally, Mormon historians agree that Joseph was practicing magic and occult rituals and whatnot.
Yeah.
Simple as that. That's kind of a knockdown case. Joe was doing this stuff.
Joe was a magician, and he was a fairly incompetent one. He was a very skilled con artist, and he was a mediocre magician at best.
Fair enough.
Which is a fair amount better than his father was, who was an absolutely horrible magician.
But he did enchant those guys' guns at the turkey shoot so that they would miss him. Yeah, I mean, that's the type of mindset. That was Joe's role model. Mm-hmm. His dad, his drunkard dad, who was doing all this crazy shit too, who didn't have somebody like Lumen Walters, who was well familiar with the alchemy that was burgeoning out of Europe. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if Joe Sr. had one of these mentors like Lumen Walters was to Joseph Smith, but
we have some connections, but we'll talk about them later. It's not really worth bearing mention right now.
Okay,
because the case for Lumen Walters is our solid one right now.
Okay, fair enough.
Later in his life, he was really well known as a medical doctor. He was kind of known locally as a clairvoyant magician still, but what he was known for was being a medical doctor, and apparently his spagyrics or his medical tinctures were top notch. Like, that's what he was known for. He was
a chemist.
So
he was an early day chemist.
If we know that Joseph got his Enochian initiation from Lumen Walters, and they were hanging out and talking and sharing knowledge, is it a great stretch to say that he also imparted the Paracelsian form of alchemy, and that he may have imparted some level that gave Joseph the ability to become an adept on his own?
Okay, so now that is a leap. Now, I'm not saying that it's an unfounded leap. I'm not saying that it is a jump, like a long distance leap. I'm just saying that is a leap because we know Joe practiced alchemy, or practiced, occultism, essentially. That's white magic. We know that Lumen Walters was his mentor for a certain period of time. Even Abner Cole talked about it in the book of Pughii. Mm-hmm. And we know that Lumen Walters later used various chemicals and was well known for his remedies, essentially. It is a jump to say that, therefore, Joseph was using hallucinogens.
It is.
Okay.
And so this
bridge that gap for me.
Okay. So this is where in 1820, so we have late 1822, he comes into contact with Lumen Walters, and they're working together. It is around this time that he starts to use magic himself, and he's reported by multiple sources to be using the same ceremonial magic practices as Lumen. it is only about 6 to 9 months after this that we see the first church verified documented occasion of the 1823 September 22nd incident, where he first talks to an angel. What we need to go into, and this is what bridges the gap, is the area that Joseph was living in at the time, and what is now considered today to be the sacred grove is surrounded by pine and birch forests. And the most prolific mushroom that grows on birch and pine is Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, which also bears heavy astrological symbolism to Jupiter. So if one is walking around with Mars and Jupiter symbology on your person, it is not a great leap to suggest that you are familiar with the usage of fly agaric.
I guess I don't quite understand. What are the connections between this mushroom that grows and the astrological symbol Jupiter? I'm curious.
So we have to talk a little bit more about the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone was supposed to be a conjunction between the sun and the moon, and it was supposed to be a hermaphroditic, that's important, a hermaphroditic child of the sun and moon, which is a great description of a mushroom if you don't have descriptive words for what taxonomically a mushroom is. Again, you go into that sky god, virgin earth symbolism that is dated all the way back to Mesopotamia. I have some quotes from contemporaries of Joseph at the time.
Yes, I'd like to hear some of those.
Let's talk a little bit about a man named Ethan Allen Hitchcock.
Aha, yes. He was a laudanum dude too, right?
I don't know, actually. I haven't read anything about his laudanum use.
Okay, my mistake.
He did know about mushrooms, though. He was a noted alchemist, and the reason I'm using him as a source is because he is a very well-respected West Point graduate and lifelong soldier. He was a prolific journal keeper, and he was a bit of a bibliophile. He had a prolific library. His alchemical library was considered the largest in America at the time. It had over 250 texts.
And he was a contemporary of Joseph.
Not only was he a contemporary of Joseph, but he grew up in the same area. He was the same age as Alvin, and when Joseph was born in Sharon, Vermont, Ethan Hitchcock and his family were 60 miles away.
No shit.
I'm not suggesting that they knew each other.
Well, yeah, but they came out of the same place.
But just to emphasize that people at this time and area were familiar with this material, Ethan Allen Hitchcock is a prime example.
Okay, so let's hear what he has to say about this.
So this is found in the back flyleaf of his book, Remarks Upon Alchemy, which was published in 1857. Quote, "The secret of our stone shall shew itself forth as though it bloomed sweetly upon the dunghill. And if you shall ask me what it resembles, I shall say to you that it lives and is to be found in the likeness and form of many things in nature." This is the important bit. "For it can be as the moon, as has been said. If they say the moon is blue, we must believe it is true. But this is only if molested, for the color of the moon is white in its naturalistic state."
Okay, so the moon means something.
Okay.
Specifically.
As a mycologist, when I read this, I hear a perfect description of a mushroom from somebody who doesn't know what a mushroom is. Because when a psilocybin mushroom, which is a dung-loving hallucinogenic mushroom, most hallucinogenic mushrooms can be categorized into dung lovers, wood lovers, or grass lovers.
So you have Amanita, who oftentimes blooms from birch and pine.
Exactly.
You have what essentially births out of cow dung.
Mm-hmm.
That's psilocybin.
So liberty caps, for example, like we talked about with Benjamin Franklin, liberty caps are often found in grass. And that's why they're prolific throughout Wales and England, because they have so many like wide open plains that are really rich in dung. So you have the conjunction of the sun and moon and this hermaphroditic child that is born that looks like the moon. This is a perfect description of a cubensi mushroom. When you are picking them, they are almost all white. And when you touch them, one of the ways of identifying them accurately is they bruise blue. So when you touch them, they almost immediately form these blue bruises wherever you touch them. And if you cut them on the underside where you cut them, they kind of form a little scab that is bright blue. It's a very vibrant blue.
So when he says... say that again. What did he say?
For it can be as the moon, as has been said. If they say the moon is blue, we must believe that it is true. But this is only if molested. For the color of the moon is white in its naturalistic state.
Well, given your description, that sounds exactly like what you described.
And if you take into account that, again, these guys had to couch this all in esoteric symbolism and secrecy because, they didn't want a bunch of state and church authorities, especially a guy who was a lifelong soldier. He couldn't just go out and say that he was a mushroom head. He had to at least hint at this, and if not openly admit to it.
Interesting.
So this is a contemporary of Joseph, and I don't necessarily think that psilocybin mushrooms are the best candidate for Joseph's entheogen use, based on what I see.
Okay, we'll have to get into that.
And again, there's so many vehicles for this to work that I'm totally willing to talk about which ones work and which ones don't, because they all don't work. I'm not saying that he just had a very large pharmacopoeia. He only knew about a handful of these substances, as far as I can tell. And when it works and where it works is what we're trying to figure out.
Okay, so I guess
in regards to the Amanitas, why that gap can be bridged. The reason Amanita muscaria works is because the forests around Joseph were covered in birch and pine wood. And the prime time to pick Amanita muscaria is in late September after the first rains following summer.
That's convenient.
It's very
Come
convenient.
back every year, Joseph. I'll give you the plates next year.
Exactly.
Right.
Don't tell anyone where I am.
Right. Of course.
So, Joseph running around with a bunch of treasure seekers who shared a part in anything that he found. Mm-hmm. He had to keep this secret from them. And he couldn't help himself. It did leak out. He had to talk about it because he was a braggart. And it created this problem for him that kind of spiraled out of control. What I see is him meet Lumen Walters. In early 1823, he starts to perform these magical rites. And by September of 1823, he's talking to angels. And if you look at the account of that first visitation from Moroni, where it's kind of taking place at night and then in the morning and then again and in different places, and he goes to the hill. We can go over this with a fine-tooth comb and I can show you how this works. But just for the sake of time and argument, he was in the right place at the right time, and later around 1832, 1834, all of the neighbors that lived around him, the Smiths at the time, begin signing affidavits that state that around this time, he was seen publicly drunk.
Right.
And was running around, being
brawling with people.
Yes.
Just being a dick.
Actually, one of my favorite, there's a quote from History of Mormonism, E.B. Howe. It is.
Ah, yes, Mormonism Unveiled.
So, this is a quote from neighbor Barton Stafford.
Okay.
And this is what he said. This is shortly after he married Emma. And I believe this would have taken place somewhere around September or October based on the description.
I think he married her spring of January of 27.
And this took place during harvest of 27. Okay. So around September.
When he got the plates, supposedly.
This description is just of him getting drunk on cider. So this is just to emphasize that he was what his attitude was like when he was fucked up.
Okay.
Quote, he, one day while at work in my father's field, got quite drunk on a consumption of cider, molasses, and water. So we know he was mixing things too.
Cider, molasses, and water. Make it taste a little better, right?
Yes, I think cider.
Well, because the Smiths,
fine.
Yeah, well, but the Smiths, they were molasses dealers, essentially. That's what they did.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Continuing on. Finding his legs to refuse their office, he leaned upon the fence and hung for some time. At length...
we've all been there. Come on, man.
Oh, God, just make it stop spinning. Okay.
Hold me up. Hold my hair back.
Continuing on. At length, recovering again, he fell to scuffling with one of the workmen, who tore his shirt nearly off of him. His wife, who was at our house on a visit, appeared very much grieved at the conduct, and to protect his back from the rays of the sun and conceal his nakedness, threw her shawl over his shoulders and in plight escorted the prophet home.
She said, God damn it, not again, Joe.
As evidence of
fucking every weekend?
Every time, I can't take you anywhere. As evidence of his piety and devotion, when intoxicated, he frequently made his religion a topic of conversation. This is substantiated by two other witnesses, this incident.
And it's not the only quote we have of Joe being fucked up. Like, there's many times when this happened.
While he says that he was drunk on a mixture of cider, molasses, and water, it would have been unbelievably easy for Joseph to slip in some of his own homemade tincture into a mix like that.
Had he learned from Lewin Walters or whoever.
Yeah. And this particular scenario, I think, sounds like a drunken brawl. We have a number of quotes about him being publicly drunk and causing a ruckus around the September, October-ish dating. If you look at Siberian or Scandinavian berserkers, let's look at the Scandinavian berserkers, famously using Amanita muscaria to get into their ecstatic states. They were mixing alcohol and flyagerics to basically go into these berserker rages, and that's how they fought their battles.
Feeling no pain. Well, and like even people on LSD will do some really crazy shit with reckless abandon, no regard for physical preservation.
Exactly. Well, and we know he liked to brawl. We know he liked to scuffle, especially when he was messed up. But it is worth noting that we see a lot of it happen around this harvest season time period. And
I'll have to look into that more for the dating purposes, because I know that a lot of the quotes were, a couple of them are taken from Mormonism Unveiled, and they aren't necessarily dated. And I'll have to look into that definitely a little bit more. But, I assume that is playing into the idea that, like, harvest time comes around, I got a whole shitload of shrooms, I'm going to eat a bunch, and then he runs out later on in the year or whatever, right? And
it was common practice at the time for people hiring field workers to provide them with hard cider, so that it's like a smoke break.
Right.
And him mixing it with molasses and cider adding a flyageric tincture to apple cider would greatly affect its taste.
Oh,
and
put a little sugar in there.
I would say the only explanation, personally, I think cider tastes just fine. The only reason I would add anything to cider is because I had already added something to it.
That made it taste like shit.
That made it taste like shit.
Or, cow dung or whatever, wherever you got it from.
Mushrooms famously they taste a bit like shriveled up, dried up scrotum sack. They're just not. They're not pleasant. They're not pleasant.
Yummy! Especially the ones that are covered in shit.
Yeah. So we see it's during this time period we see a distinct evolution in Joseph's story, and you see it happen yearly. I'm not necessarily saying that I think he came up with the idea for the Book of Mormon, or that he wrote the Book of Mormon on mushrooms.
Okay.
But based on the fact that he was repeatedly by more than one source, he was reported to be drunk during translation process. and how the translation process took place, it's highly... it suggests that he was perhaps not just drunk based on the fact that he liked to shut all the light out.
Yes, okay. What do you mean by that?
So you have... In 1823, the angel tells him to come back the next year. I believe it's 1825 when he tries to bring Samuel Lawrence over. And this kind of sets up our story for the 1827 incident where he's running through the woods. I think he may have blabbed a little bit and showed Samuel Lawrence his spot, but didn't tell him what it was. They had the scene where they were trying to scry the plates together, and Samuel Lawrence was the one that first saw the spectacles.
Yeah, and they saw spectacles, and he's like, "Are you sure you see him? Are you sure?" And then Joe's like, "Oh yeah, I totally see him now."
Exactly. Yeah. We see just an evolution of what he was going to bring to the world. And it's not until the translation process begins that we see it solidify and he has a distinct narrative in mind. We talked a little bit about automatic writing.
Okay. Yeah.
Where you don't need to do this with the help of entheogens. People can automatic write on their own. But the idea is that you get into an altered state and you
just talk.
You just talk.
And somebody like Oliver Cowdery sits there and writes.
Apparently someone on the other side of the veil is using you to talk through. That's the idea. And
whether it was Sidney Rigdon channeling the prophet Phineas in section 89 in 1873 before he died, or whether it was Joseph Smith channeling Nephi or whoever, right?
Joseph using this particular method of his head in a hat with the stone at the bottom, and dictating hour after hour uninterrupted is a great example of automatic writing. The problem with automatic writing is it's highly subjective or susceptible to anachronisms and falsehoods that are known by the person that is the medium.
Okay.
So all of the anachronisms we find in the Book of Mormon can be explained by Joseph conducting this form of automatic writing, and his basically subconscious just kind of mishmashes everything he has read, and that's where he starts spitting out the War of 1812, and he starts spitting out this stuff that's been suggested to him by Walters and the Hellenistic or the Hermetic influences. Like, we see a lot of Hermeticism in early Mormonism in the Book of Mormon, and how the church gets structured after that.
I have a couple of questions regarding the decade from 23 to 29. Mm-hmm. I have a couple of questions regarding that time. One of which was in 1823-ish. Lucy Mack Smith told about, in her book Biographical Sketches, she told about Joseph having... or telling the family about reciting them, telling them about the ancient inhabitants of the continent, and telling about their wars and their rituals and their religious ceremonies and stuff like that.
This is before Alvin died, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because Alvin died in...
This was right after he found the...
So I think she was describing sometime in 23 when this was going on, and Alvin didn't die till I think it was 25.
Yeah, I think that incident was right after his first encounter with Nephi or Moroni.
Maybe that was November of 23 that Alvin died.
I thought it was Alvin died immediately after the first encounter, and I thought that incident was right after his first, when he first came back with like, oh my god, I found plates and this magic angel.
And maybe it did, but I'm wondering if there's a connection to the studying that Lumen Walters had done, and Joe learning things from Lumen Walters, and then taking that knowledge and talking to his family and telling him about all this cool shit that he learned from his mentor. I'm wondering if there's something to that. Maybe it was Walters, maybe somebody else took Joe to a ceremony, or they told him about a ceremony or something that was passed down from the Native Americans that Joe was very interested in. I'm curious because I don't. It seems like that just crops up out of the blue. He just starts reciting these stories to the family. They must have come from somewhere.
From what I understand, he was a bit of a nut for treasure books. He really liked pirate stories, and some of the books we can verify came from the Smith Library. Include books about Captain Kidd. I can't remember the exact title.
Yeah, I think so.
And the Hill Cumorah, and a lot of people believe that there was hidden treasure from pirates and stuff in the area. Joseph, I believe, the idea that he had some type of secret or esoteric knowledge of the ancient inhabitants of America is absurd. And based on what he said, we know now from anthropology and the study of archaeology and whatnot that it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
But I do think...
And they weren't new. They weren't new ideas.
It's not new, but it's also not incredibly imaginative. And frankly, you have a captive audience that is ready to listen to any entertainment that's going to come out of your mouth.
No TV.
I don't see a lot of... there's not a lot in that story that really says anything special to me, other than that Joseph was a really charismatic storyteller.
Okay. That's absolutely fair.
And I honestly don't... He wasn't reported to be drunk around this time. I don't necessarily know if the first time he experienced the angel, he was high. He may not have been. He could have been doing this all with the magic provided by Lumen. And sometimes you have to do the same ritual months over and over and over and over before it works. So that is yet to be...
Or every year at the same time, every single year.
And that's really yet to be worked out enough that I could say yes or no, he was using these at this time.
Okay.
I think it's somewhere between 23 and 27. Probably the closer you get to 27, the more verifiable it is that he was using.
So I have another quote, and this was pulled from Mormonism Unveiled as well. Of course, that's known as the first anti-Mormon book, but they were affidavits collected by Eber Howe and Philasus Hurlbut from people that were actually neighbors of Joseph Smith, one of which was Peter Ingersoll. I was thinking it was Lorenzo Saunders that said this, but it was Lorenzo Saunders was the guy who connected Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith before 1830. But this is from Peter Ingersoll. He says... One day he, meaning Joseph, came and greeted me with a joyful countenance. Upon asking the cause of his unusual happiness, he replied in the following language. As I was passing yesterday, across the woods after a heavy shower of rain, I found in a hollow some beautiful white sand that had washed up by the water. I took off my frock and tied up several quarts of it, and then went home. On my entering the house, I found the family at the table eating dinner. They were all anxious to know the contents of my frock. At that moment, I happened to think of what I had heard about the history found in Canada called the Golden Bible. So I very gravely told them it was the Golden Bible. To my surprise, they were credulous enough to believe what I said. Accordingly, I told them that I had received a commandment and let no one see it, for, says I, no man can see it with the naked eye and live. There's another chunk later on in the quote, and it says, Now, said Joe, I have got the damn fools fixed and will carry out the fun. End quote. What's that? What's that? After a heavy shower of rain?
Yeah.
I found in a hollow some beautiful white sand?
White sand.
What's that?
If you were to take a bunch of mushrooms and dry them out, say amanita or even psilocybin, if you were to harvest them and dry them, it's very easy to grind them into a powder, and when you do so, it resembles sand.
No kidding.
It doesn't have the same texture, but if you opened a bag and she was like, hey, I got white sand, anybody who looked inside would probably go, yeah, it looks like white sand.
No shit. But, I mean, it says specifically after a heavy shower of rain.
On a log. That's a very interesting... I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, but another quote from Mormonism Unveiled.
Incident.
So, yeah, and this would have happened in 27 because he said, I have the gold Bible, and that's when people said in 1827 he has the gold Bible. Mm-hmm. And this probably would have been at the same time that he was running through the forest and punching motherfuckers, supposedly with 200 pounds of gold under his arm.
Much more likely is that he had several pounds of mushrooms, which is a lot of mushrooms.
Yeah, ground up, preserved, or even he had just picked it up.
He could have just picked them fresh and just a bag full of mushrooms.
Or his
way
frock,
easier
his coat.
to run 2 miles through the dead of night and beating up fucking attackers than with a magic breastplate, and thumbrum, and 200 pounds of gold. Like, much more feasible that he could have done that while carrying mushrooms.
Right, and I've always thought about that story as just like a complete fabrication, just because Joe was a hero. But if there's a foundation in reality, all of his treasure digger friends, they would have been sharing all of the plunder, sharing all of the loot, the treasure that they found.
And the only two people that feasibly would have known about these secrets are the seers in the group, which would
Lorenzo Saunders?
Lumen Walters, Lorenzo Saunders, and
Samuel Lawrence.
Samuel Lawrence.
Not Lorenzo Saunders, Samuel Lawrence. That's who I meant to say in the first, yeah.
And he's the guy that Joseph takes to the hill and whatnot. I think Samuel Lawrence and Abner Cole Willard Chase heard enough from Joseph just not being able to keep his mouth shut that they figured out he had something, and it may not have been the plates. Them setting up a group and going out in the middle of night in September looking for this thing that's traditionally when and how you looked for mushrooms.
You'll find a lot more when you got a big group of people looking for them.
I'm not ready to buy that version of the story, but it is worth talking about because it is a way easier story to swallow if you take out the breastplate, and thummim, and 200 pounds of gold plates. And
you factor the possibility of that into them using, Joe being a seer, holding his head up to his face to exclude the light. They go out treasure digging because they see treasures. If you're out, walking around in the forest and, a bunch of guys together and they're all tripping, might they start seeing treasure or have one person that starts seeing treasure and says, I see it, let's start digging? It seems possible.
And I failed to mention this earlier, but the easiest way to have vivid hallucinations is to do it in the dark.
Oh, no shit.
So it's way easier to have hallucinations at night or in a dark room than it is out in noonday. Which is, again, why if he was using these while he did his automatic writing, it would have helped him a lot.
Yeah, because if he's excluding all of the light, then his brain is forced to use blackness and create its own
and
vision,
if he's
essentially,
focusing on this automatic writing, he very well could have seen golden letters coming up through and just... that description could be very accurate.
But that would also require him... essentially, especially like when Ulrich Kadri came along, him just being fucked up for like months on end, for a couple of months straight, fucking blasted, the whole time. Well, and that's a bridge. I mean, not a bridge, but that's a gap, right? That's a bit of a leap. It's like, I know. Okay, so like people can smoke weed every day, people can drink every day, not hard, or else they'll fucking die. But like, I know that, like, people generally don't do mushrooms, like, 2 days in a row, do they?
No, you can, but the amount your body absorbs and your ability to experience anything is drastically reduced. And if you do it repeatedly over and over, it kind of fizzles out.
Oh, shit.
And so a lot of people do it sporadically, or they microdose daily. But based on how Joseph treated mind-altering substances, I don't think he did anything with anything,
reservation.
Anything with reservation. Everything was in excess.
That's fair, I think.
There's several scenes in Hearts Made Glad where he describes the early Mormon church holding these big feasts where basically everybody just got drunk, passing around a pail full of wine. And Joseph was quoted as getting so drunk he couldn't leave his chair.
That's not somebody that has a lot of self-control, I would think, right?
And so it's... all of these materials were available. The people who knew how to use them were in his life. Mm-hmm. It becomes harder and harder to ignore. And Lumen Walters is certainly not the only person that could have introduced him to this. We actually should, for the sake of time, probably move on to like the School of Prophets or the end-all be-all that is the Kirkland Temple dedication.
Yeah, because that's kind of what was the genesis of all of this conversation being essentially introduced into the podcast. Is like, it was a field of study I completely wasn't aware was even a thing until I slightly tapped into it in order to do the research for that, and then people just sent a flood of information that I'm like, I don't know what to do with all this. It's too confusing. So, yeah.
And regardless of, I know what we've talked about so far is more or less speculation. The one incident in Joseph's life that I can say, unapologetically, he was using entheogens and he was drugging his congregation is the Kirkland Temple dedication.
Okay.
There is no possible way that anyone could elicit that response in that many people that safely and that consistently without the aid of plant medicines. And if you take
that's a strong claim.
If you take into account the setting, the fact that he was passing around sacramental wine that was suspected to be drugged by several of the people there, who later signed affidavits saying, "I think the wine is drugged." And one person, I think J.J. Moss or Jesse Moss, actually tried to steal a bottle of the wine and was caught because he wanted to prove that it was drugged.
No shit.
He encouraged people at the temple dedication to take as much as they wanted.
Okay, well, I have to stop you because I want to get into the temple dedication ceremony, and that's where this is going. Mm-hmm. But first, we have to at least touch on the School of the Elders.
Okay, yeah.
They're all-night parties. This is the first time that I was like, there's some shit going on here. All these guys get together in a room, then Joe and Rigdon and whoever puts some anointing oil on their head, and then they're just seeing shit all night long. And that was the first time that I was like, this is fucking weird.
Well, and it's not just one thing. There's clear experimentation going on here. There's a scene. Okay. There's a scene in the School of the Prophets where they try and make the anointing oil that's described in Exodus, and they can't find any of the materials, and the only thing they can find and afford is cinnamon, which is actually different from sweet cinnamon, which is what they were supposed to find.
Okay.
And they made this cinnamon oil and then basically got naked and doused each other like head to toe in this oil, and were obviously trying to get high off of it. Like, you don't do that.
Cinnamon isn't going to get you there. Well, cinnamon alone.
No, just as an anointing. Do Mormons anoint people like that ever?
Full body dousing?
Ever?
Well, would you
do that without trying to elicit some type of response like that?
Well, it's been part of the Mormon temple ritual to, essentially be naked. They changed this in, I think, 92, but you're essentially naked and you had a tarp on, and then they anointed your breast, your navel, and then your head. But it was just consecrated oil.
And it's just a tiny amount.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a finger wipe, essentially.
The reason why oil is
they weren't like pouring it on their head.
And the reason why oil is such a useful medium for delivery is because the biggest organ on your body is your epidermis. If you strip naked and coat your body in this, it's a pretty effective method of delivering anything you think might be in that oil. Do you get what I'm saying?
That's fair. Yeah, you soak up a lot of shit through your skin.
I see that as pretty clear experimentation in the Prophet of Elders, especially since they were like, oh, let's see if it really works, and all we can get was cinnamon. Try it anyway. We'll see. You know what I mean?
Put it in the bag. We'll mix it up. We'll call it good. But so obviously they were experimenting. According to this, they are experimenting with cinnamon. that's probably not the only thing they're trying.
No.
Right?
And based on the descriptions of what happened in the School of Prophets, we have, I think it was Lyman Wright. Was it
Lyman White?
Lyman White?
Yeah, General Lyman White.
There's a scene
Super
where
badass.
he's locked up and his face goes black and he has like a really bad trip.
Yeah, his fingers are locked in the shape of claws, and he goes around trying to talk to people, but he can't open his mouth.
Which is a pretty good description of a datura overdose.
Oh, shit.
It's... Again, there's a few entheogenic candidates we could look at, but in the School of Prophets, it is worth noting that we see an evolution in delivery method, because he goes from alcohol-based deliveries before 1831 to now he's using oils. Mm-hmm. This could have been due to his influence from the guy known as Black Pete.
Okay. Not much exists about this guy.
Not much, so it's hard to say. We'll talk about it. We'll call him Pete, just because he's the only Pete in the story.
But all of his friends called him Black Pete.
Okay.
Zwart Pete. I know, it's horrible. But yeah, well, let's call him Pete. Let's call him Peter Kerr, because that's...
is that his name?
Yeah, his... Okay. So slave names were really tricky back then, because they essentially, when they came across, or they were shipped over... the owners and masters would always give them a new name so that they would distance themselves from their previous life, essentially. It was a psychological trick. Mm-hmm. And this guy, it's hard to nail down what his actual name was. We know the name of his mother. I think it was like Kuno or something like that. It starts with a K, ends with an A. It's some weird, like African hoodoo type of name. And she was brought over from Africa, and then Pete Kerr was owned by the Kerr family, so they just called him Pete or John or whatever they wanted to call him. And I think he moved to Pennsylvania or something to that effect. They went to a free state, and Peter Kerr was given his freedom, and he was one of the first people baptized into the church in Kirtland. In 1830, it would have been 30 when the mission trip was first on the way out there. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, he was one of the first members of the church living in Ohio, this guy, Peter Kerr.
Mm-hmm. And he was apparently a root doctor, and that's the important bit.
Yeah, and his mom was, came over. She was an African native, and she may have had, hoodoo connections or whatnot, but the history on this guy is so tenuous.
It's hard, but it is worth noting that root doctors are famous for using oils as a means of delivery, and their entheogens of choice are datura and amanita. Root doctoring is kind of a unique blending of West African hoodoo and voodoo mixed with some shamanistic, like Eastern United States Native American shamanism. Okay. Particularly like the Algonquin and tribes around that area. So again, we have another solid source for being able to give Joseph this knowledge about Amanita, as well as a new source of information for oil delivery and datura use, which is what we see in the School of Prophets.
And now, let's say datura is one of the nastier hallucinogens. It's a nightshade, is that correct?
It is a nightshade, and one of the reasons why I don't think it's a prime candidate for something like the Kirkland event is because it has a notorious reputation for either giving people bad trips or giving them a physically hard time. Like you can get locked up and experience these like rigor mortis, or what are they called?
Yeah, rigor mortis.
They have a special name for it when you're alive, but these locked up,
like rigid
paralysis, lockjaw, your face turns colors, and you're just physically in a really bad way.
Sounds like what Lyman White was described with.
And you can also get some experiences like this through overdoses of Amanita, but it's
take a higher dosage to do it, though.
It takes a higher dose, but you don't consistently see those type of reactions, and those type of reactions from Amanita are pretty rare.
Interesting. Okay.
That's pretty consistently looks like a Datura overdose.
Okay, so let's talk about Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony specifically.
Okay.
I mean, the School of the Elders, I talked about it in the episode, like, these sound like all-night parties, simple as that. It sounds like they're using, like, there's something in this oil that they're using, and they're doing it, consecutive days in a row. But, of course, Kirtland Temple dedication, this is known as, one of the most faith-building spiritual experiences in all of church history. I remember hearing about it when I was in the church and thinking, oh, wow, God must have been really powerful, must have been really impressive to have, to have all of these people see things like this. But as historians have no connection or have no ability to invoke God as an explanation for something happening, we have to go to a naturalistic perspective. Historians can't say God did it. Historians can't or have to rely on naturalism. So, what, in your opinion, what happened in the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony?
I believe there's some strong evidence to suggest that Joseph, and I believe he had one or two helpers. We can maybe talk about potentially who those are.
Okay.
But he had one or two helpers that he used to create a large amount of hallucinogenic wine. And he very easily could have done this with either an ergot tincture of some kind, but I think more likely he was using Amanita, because you can create an ungodly amount of hallucinogenic wine with one mushroom.
No shit.
Because of how the chemicals break down, and then the mushroom will actually start to reproduce. It'll start to replicate itself in the wine as a medium.
So it's like super ferment, right?
Well, it'll basically it'll start to it'll imbue the wine with muscimol instead of growing into a whole new mushroom. It'll basically revert to its mycelium stage, and you'll get this like little mat of mycelium on top of the wine. Okay. And it'll basically just produce hallucinogens into the wine.
You just shake that shit up and
you're flying, scoop off the top and you pour what's left of it out, and it's the wine that you filter out is incredibly hallucinogenic
and easy. You just take wine and put a couple mushrooms in it. It's done.
The descriptions of what the wine tasted like, it was described as a sweet wine. The first thing you do to cover up any taste is to add honey.
Molasses.
And we know that they like to use cloves and nutmeg and a lot of spices in it too, which would instantly cover up anything that unpleasant you would taste.
Wow.
I believe you have a reliable method of delivery in that when you tell your congregation to take as much as they please, there's a social reaction that takes place.
Ah, yes.
All of the kids are like, what? The prophet said we can drink as much as we want?
Right.
All of the moms immediately hawkeye the children because they know what's coming next.
Drunk kids.
Yeah. All of the kids don't get away with drinking a great deal of it. The women at the time would have been aware of their place in society and would have wanted to look respectable, and probably
little sips.
Probably would have taken pretty little sips. Mm-hmm. And all of the guys that got up, as far as we can tell, some of them wanted to be big, manly, burly men, and I'm going to take as much Sacramento wine as I can.
Yeah, William Smith Hawking and
consequently, those are the ones we see having a really hard time. We see some very interesting reactions from people drinking just wine.
Just wine. Which would be expected if it were... Well, I don't know.
I think the
frat parties that are, all-night benders that they, 10 guys drain 15 cases of beer, maybe they would be, puking and stuff that much, but they still wouldn't see shit.
No. And when
alcohol alone it doesn't have the punch to do that unless you push your body to the very limits of its physical abilities.
It's set and setting.
Right.
You take those same frat guys, you put them in a church, give them the same amount of alcohol, they're just going to get drunk in a church. If you give 10 theologians a very small amount of psilocybin or a hallucinogen of some kind, and you program a trip for them so they're singing songs, they're listening to things that make them feel spiritually connected.
Sidney Rigdon's sermons, man.
You're shouting hosannas. Like, everyone is getting into this uplifted, altered state. On top of the fact that they've just been given a hallucinogenic wine. You can consistently reproduce this scene with those variables. And I don't know how you can ignore this specific scene and say that it was just 1,000 people that just miraculously got off like this. The only time in human history that's ever happened, apparently.
Right. Well, and I mean, I guess there are like mass hallucinations that happen. There are a very few number of those that are localized, but
they can usually be sourced to a hallucinogen of some kind.
And I don't know about that because I haven't studied it. That could be true. That could be false. I simply don't know.
We talked a little bit about ergotism in St. Anthony's fire.
Yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit.
The incidence of mass hysteria throughout medieval Europe can be traced to ergotized grain heads and people eating contaminated bread and beer. So, for example, ergot, which is an LSD-like alkaloid, can if safely consumed, like we talked about, can pretty consistently elicit these psilocybin or LSD-like experiences.
Right, but ergot can also fuck your day.
It can also, it's really dangerous. And if you're not really, really, really good at what you do, which, frankly, I don't see Joseph having the skill set to do that. And he wasn't inducted in, or he wasn't a Freemason yet, as far as I'm aware.
I don't think so.
And
but he knew about
the only other source where he could have gotten that from was Hiram or the Masons. Lumen may have known the secret of St. Anthony's fire, but it's pretty unlikely. A much more likely candidate is mushrooms.
Okay. Well, and just the simple availability of them in Ohio, New England area. I mean, they're just, Amanitas just everywhere. You just go walking around and grab a couple, throw them in a big barrel of wine, and everybody's tripping.
Exactly.
And I think it also needs to be said, like, Joe being this cunning con man, right? This vindictive person who was just out to get whatever he could, whatever money, whatever women he could. It may be a simplistic person, or a simplistic generalization of who the person Joseph Smith really was, right? But we know that he wasn't beyond using props to pull a con.
Yeah.
Just at the very basis, the seer stone was a prop the whole time.
You told me the interesting thing about the dove. I never heard.
Yeah, I was about to go into this. When it came to like Martin Harris, he had no problem, having the character's manuscript or, having plates that were chinking on the other side of the towel that they had up. But at one point, this was in the Kirtland years, Joseph had a pet dove and he trained it to come and eat a little piece of corn or wheat out of his ear so that he would be preaching a sermon from the pulpit and have the window open. And the dove would fly in, he'd scratch his ear real quick, and then the dove would fly in, land on his shoulder, and then nibble the thing out of his ear, and he would say, "I'm getting a message from the Lord's messenger." These were props. He was a con man. Is it really that far of an intellectual leap to say he was willing to use hallucinogenic drugs that he knew would elicit these reactions in order to get his people to believe? Or have spiritual experiences?
No, I don't think that's a great leap at all.
Yeah, me neither. It seems incredibly logical.
Of these times, he even says, like to Lyman Wright, he tells him, "You're gonna see God tomorrow."
Right.
There's several moments where he preps these people and says, "You're gonna see something crazy.
Right.
You just wait."
And then there's also descriptions of people hearing a whooshing noise,
which is very common to people when they first get that moment of "I took something."
I had this, essentially, this has happened like twice when I've just gotten too high on weed, and I've had that same experience right before I pass out, and I just hear, like, my whole body gets warm, and then I hear, like, the sound of rushing water or, like, wind, and then, you know, my fingers start tingling, and then I pass out. Yeah. But I was like, I just got way too fucking high. Do not pass that to me again. Like, it's happened a couple of times, but I understood what was happening. Yeah. But that whooshing noise sound, there were more than just a couple of people that said that they heard that whooshing noise in the temple. Is that a spirit swooping in? Maybe some kind of spirit. Right? If their spirits were being lifted by the wine.
Exactly. Our hearts were made glad.
Well, and Lamar Peterson, he recounts a lot of Joe being fucked up in that book. Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't read it myself, but you told me all about this.
The second part of that, he just highlights the Kirkland years.
Yeah.
And because the Kirkland scene, up until the Kirkland dedication, is about the craziest it gets. After the Kirkland dedication, you see events kind of spiral out of Joseph's control. And right. I believe for the next 4 or 5 years, maybe for the rest of his life, he loses contact with these medicines because
he's just too busy, right?
Well, on top of that, he doesn't reliably know how to find these things. I think the first time and the first places he found the mushrooms was more by chance and Lumen showing him how to do it.
Maybe.
And up until this century, we didn't really understand how mushrooms reproduced or where they reproduced. It was kind of a magic thing that, as far as science was concerned.
It was treasure to find them.
Exactly. How do you use those words?
So after Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, I think there was one more time where Oliver Cowdery and Joe kind of team up and have like one last hurrah. Mm-hmm. And I think that was after the dedication. But after this time, the revelations slow down a lot. Most of the Doctrine and Covenants, what's included in today's Doctrine and Covenants, happened before 1838. It was all revealed well up to before that time. But I think that there's literally just too much going on. Maybe Joe just kind of outgrew this, or like you said, it wasn't available to him, or whatever the case may be. But like, when he's in Missouri and there are mobs surrounding towns and he has his Danite militia, surrounding justices' homes in order to get them to sign something under duress, like, there's just too much shit going on, right? Exactly. Like, you can't get into a comfortable place where you can just start tripping just for fun. Like,
and he's constantly dealing with other Mormons that are trying to usurp his power. And it's a clusterfuck for him. And even if he did know where to get him, like you said, he just didn't have the time. Like this spiraled out of control until like the Nauvoo days, when things kind of settled for a little bit. Mm-hmm. And again, we see an influx of revelation when he meets Alexander Nabor, who I don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that he knew any of these practices. And I don't really have a lot of solid evidence to suggest that he brought that back into Joseph's life. But his Kabbalic influence and Hermetic influence is undeniable. In the fucking King Follett discourse, he's practically quoting the Hermeticum.
That's amazing.
It's pretty ridiculous. The section I read you about the nature of God and understanding God, he's saying that in the King Follett discourse.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
and Alexander Nabor joined the church in, I think, the mid-30s, and he joined the saints in Nauvoo in 41. And he brought with him a huge Kabbalistic library.
Wow.
And
I didn't know that.
He had almost all of the core text. We know what his library was.
Wow.
And he had almost all of the core Kabbalistic texts. Lance Owens covers this in his article I mentioned in the last podcast. And he lists all of the books we know he had. And you see its influence in Joseph. Again, you kind of see an influx in revelation, and because the Nauvoo days settle down a little bit for him, there is reason, I think, to at least speculate that he may have had a few times where he could have done this again. Mm-hmm. But largely after Kirkland, it was pretty much he just didn't have time to do this regularly.
Fair enough. And we see a decline in revelations and spiritual visitations and whatnot. Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody talks about seeing God or seeing the ancient prophets during the far west Missouri years when Joe and Rigdon are camped out there or in Diamond. Like, there's just that just was the last thing on their mind. They were battling people for food. They were starving. They didn't just... I think, yeah, it makes sense. They were just too busy to have it happen. But like this, Joe's magnum opus or whatever would have been back in Kirtland, the dedication ceremony. That was... I mean, he elicited hallucinations in hundreds of people. That's crazy.
And if next...
Reliably, too.
Yeah. And next to probably his, the Council of the 50, probably next to that, this may have, and his polygamy and everything, this may have been this was the biggest secret, but based on how he reacted when he knew he was going to Carthage, and he told William Clayton to burn or bury the record of the kingdom, I don't think William Clayton knew about what was going on, but the other person I suspect to have been his helper would have, and I suspect he probably would have burned them instead of buried them. So I have suspicion that Orrin Porter Rockwell was his entheogenic partner, if you will.
No shit.
They opened a bar together. They were both they liked to get drunk together.
They were limping buddies from a young age. They were friends.
That's a whole bears its own. We'll have to go into that more.
Yeah, definitely. I have sitting on my bookshelf the biography of OPR, and I haven't read it quite yet. But when that does happen, maybe we'll have to dive into this again. Because holy shit!
And if he did let anyone else know, it would have been someone like that, if not him.
One of his childhood friends.
And when he left for Carthage, he basically said, all of my secret shit, burn it or get rid of it. No one can find out about this because I'm a prophet.
Right.
And that would have been one of those things that burn or bury. And so it's maybe buried in somebody's garden or ashes.
Wow. That's incredible.
The world may never know.
Okay, so... This whole theory is controversial, to say the least. And it has not been espoused by the vast majority of Mormon scholars, believing or not. Just last week I had on Christopher Smith, and I asked him about it, and he essentially just called it absurd. And I had to respectfully disagree with him, because I think that there is... it's a very... When you're trying to evaluate the merits of a scientific theory, the more simple it is and the more explanatory power it has, the better it is, right? Yeah. And I think that given this theory, if it is true, it holds a lot of explanatory power. It explains so many things that you have a very hard time explaining otherwise. And let's just say, in order to refute this theory, you have to come up with a better way that all of these people had hallucinations in the Kirtland Temple. And disregarding everything else that we talked about today, the Kirtland Temple, we can hang our hat on that and say Joseph must have done something in order to elicit these reactions, in order to have so many people reproducibly having visionary experiences. So, for that matter, I think it holds an amazing amount of explanatory power, and it's so simple. It's so very simple. The knowledge base for it and understanding the history of it is incredibly complex because it's such a large topic, but the simple ability of Joe to elicit hallucinations and reproduce it over and over and have it happen on a wide scale, many, many people that were there had the hallucinations. It's a theory that fits the bill. And in order for somebody to refute the theory that Joe used hallucinogens in the Kirtland Temple, they have to not only disprove that, but they have to offer alternate evidence that would allow that to happen. Naturalistic. We can't invoke God. Historians cannot invoke God as an explanation. If Joe did not use hallucinogens in the Kirtland Temple, what did he use? That's the question.
I really can't see any other candidates that could do this reliably. And in regards to, say, other historians who haven't really covered this yet, one of the reasons I think is because mycology is kind of a new and burgeoning field. And on top of it, it's a weird field for a a tenured or renowned historian to study. Most historians who are studying Mormon history don't have any interest in mycology.
That's fair.
And the historical use of entheogens has only been studied for the last 75 years. It's really new, and it is a fringe topic. The people who are talking about it are not fringe by any means. These are very legitimate scholars and scientists. But it just hasn't really gained traction yet because it is radical and it forces you to radically change the way you look at religion and God and
drugs
and how we experience reality and just all of it. It is a truly groundbreaking thought. And it's hard for some people to palate, especially when they have absolutely no exposure to any of it. That's why a lot of this sounds so crazy. The last podcast, we covered 10,000 years in 2 hours. Like, you can only cover so much, and you still sound like a crazy person.
Right.
Before somebody has to take it upon themselves to go look it up and read it. Right. I think a lot of those reactions you're talking about where people are just dismissive is because they know how much work it's going to take and to look at that.
And the taboo factor. We can't ignore how much the taboo factor plays into this. They are Schedule 1 drugs. Exactly. If you are caught with these drugs, you go to jail forever. That's hyperbole, but still,
if you are with people that use these drugs.
Yes, if you are a legitimate scholar, scientist, historian, and you start talking about these having an influence, you are regarded as a conspiracy theorist, or, I guess that's probably too strong of a word, but it implies that there's conspiracy between Joseph and some of his other people, and maybe that's a fitting word.
Conspiracy theories exist. The Bay of Pigs was a conspiracy theory.
Well, and I think conspiracy theory is a phrase that is often used to malign something, and I disagree with it, because a theory is a scientific body of facts that explains a situation, and when you have people conspiring together in order to further something, that's a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. That's the etymology of the word. And a Joseph Smith conspiring with a couple of other people, OPR and maybe some others, in order to elucidate these hallucinogenic reactions in people. He was conspiring. It is a scientific theory, or a historical theory, I suppose. And it is essentially a conspiracy theory. So maybe that's the wrong word to use. Maybe it's the perfect word to use. But still, you're seen as a crazy person if you align with these. And that's why I want to have you on, because I don't know anything about this shit. You have been studying this much longer than I have, and you brought a lot of sources to the table, and we only used 5% of them, maybe at the most. Like I said, this is our third conversation. So far, we've spoken almost 8 hours on this topic, and I still have a very, very fleeting grasp of what this is, because it's just so challenging to wrap your mind around, and it's such a big topic. But we shouldn't be scared of a topic that's this big, especially if it holds legitimate explanatory power. Mm-hmm. And even more so just because these things are Schedule 1 drugs and you go to prison for having them on you or for being associated with people that are involved with them. Mm-hmm. That still should not deter us away from studying the impact that these things may have had on the history. That we have to divorce ourselves from the implications of what drugs are today in order to understand if they did have any sort of influence on Mormon history or any other history. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important aspect worth discussing. But I'm going to catch shit for this episode. Oh, God. I hope you know that, right? Like, who knows? Like, I really hope that some people do at least raise some questions and raise some counter theories, because I'm curious. I want to know the competing theories.
Oh, there will be. And
great.
There will be a lot of people who just disagree, and that's it. You're just
and that's not good enough. If you disagree, you have to tell me why you disagree, and you have to offer another theory that holds as much explanatory power and is more simple than the theory we proposed. Mm-hmm. And this is probably through my own ignorance, I'm incapable of even conceptualizing such a theory right now. And I really hope that somebody writes in and says so. Or, and tries to elucidate what that theory might be, right? Mm-hmm. But I want people to be able to talk to you, because I don't know about all of this, and I want them to be in touch with you directly if they have questions or if they have refutations or concerns. Mm-hmm. That being said, are you willing to give out some, like an email address or something where people can actually talk to you directly and get more information? Because we only just scratched the surface here.
Mm-hmm. I'll have a website up in the next couple months that will be focusing on these topics exclusively.
Okay,
and
good.
The history of entheogenic use. My little side pet theory with Mormon history is its own thing. But my wife and I, my wife's a religious studies major, we're starting our own little blog podcast about these topics.
Good.
And if listeners want to talk to us in the meantime, they can contact me at sillyrabbits@gmail.com. It's spelled funny. It's spelled PSILLY.rabbits@gmail.com.
Like psilocybin, silly.
Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
And we're going down a lot of rabbit holes. So
nice.
If you want to get a hold of me, that's our email. Maybe we can have it in the show notes. And
definitely.
Please fire your most vehement hatred at me and give me your best arguments. I'm looking for the best I can find. Because, like you said, I've really tried to find those serious holes in this theory, and
right.
I just don't see them. And
it often will take somebody coming in with another theory that just blows yours out of the water, and it's like, oh, god damn it. Now that makes more sense, but and that's from my perspective, I can't think of what that is. I can't, like I said, I can't conceptualize it. So I want
that to happen because,
yes,
like you said, we have our pet theories, but as a scholar, you have to have the ability to abandon it if it doesn't fit. Like
a Spalding,
like our Spalding theory,
fucking Spalding
theory,
right?
I wanted it so bad,
but and I still hold a little piece in the back of my brain. Maybe there's a tiny bit of room for it, but the more I study it, it's like it just doesn't. And if Joseph was tripping the whole fucking time in automatic writing, he could have easily done, sole authorship. So, I mean, this does not play for or against the Spalding theory, but like you said, our pet theories, sometimes we gotta put them aside.
Exactly.
And if somebody can put this theory down, nail it, absolutely coffin in the ground 6 feet under, that needs to happen. But I have yet to see that happen. Mm-hmm. So, silly rabbits, silly.rabbits.
Silly.rabbits, silly with a P.
At Gmail. Is that right?
Silly.rabbits@gmail.com.
Man, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I wish I could just poke your brain for like 9 more hours on this topic.
I wish we could too. I'd love to talk about it. I rarely get a chance to chat with people about this. There's especially anyone who will just listen to me talk about it for 4 hours now.
You need to start a podcast about it. But we'll... hopefully in the future, if we can get somebody that feels comfortable arguing against this theory, I'd love to have you on in possibly like an informal debate, kind of a discussion type of topic, have the competing theory, whatever it may be, and have your hallucinogen theory and have them go head to head on the air, because I don't want to propose just one side. This is naked Mormonism. We're stripping everything away. We want all sides of the theories. We want all the arguments. We want to see what everybody is saying about these topics. And please, I welcome somebody. If you feel like you have arguments for or against this, please get in touch with Silly Rabbits or, of course, nakedmormonism@gmail.com, because this is an honest petition for more historianship and scholarship. If this is a new burgeoning theory and it's real and it holds explanatory power, it needs to be built upon. Simple as that.
Fair enough.
That being said,
I'd like to maybe leave your audience with one thought, if I can.
Please do.
This is a saying from famed drug chemist Sasha Shulgin.
Okay.
And this is his description of psychedelics. It's one of my favorite, and I just wanted to leave your audience with it. Quote, I look upon these materials, psychedelics, as being catalytic, not productive. They do not do what occurs. They allow you to express what is in you that you had not the ability to get to and express yourself without the help of a material.
Wow.
You use the plant, you use the compound as a facilitator, as a catalyst, to see within yourself what's already there. And I think this is the heart of psychedelic drugs. I really think this is an important topic, not just for history, but for us as a society. These are important tools that we have lost contact with, and it is only through discussion and research and scholarship that they're ever going to come back into our lives.
Right.
And that's why I'm here, and that's why I wanted people to hear this. So,
dude, thank you.
Thank you.
Not only for coming on and articulating the theory well, and now I'm saying that from my own perspective after 3 conversations with you. I know the previous episode was very disjointed and confusing, and it may have been a little bit tough for people to follow, but I was understanding a lot because we've already had many hours of discussion leading up to that. But for this episode, for articulating the connections between Mormonism and possible hallucinogen use, I think this has been extremely productive conversation, and I've learned quite a lot, and I hope the listeners have learned just as much, because this is just such a fascinating topic. This is just amazing. So thank you both for coming onto the show, and even more so for doing the research and compiling this, for having 4 pages worth of sources, for having so much to bring to the table. You fucking did your homework, and you came onto a platform where hopefully you feel like you were able to present your theory fairly. And just thank you so much for this work. I look forward to your podcast, man.
Thank you for giving me the time. Thanks for looking at this with an open mind and sharing all this information with everybody, because it needs to get out there.
Absolutely. And that is it for the Part 2 discussion with Cody. Now, I hope that all of you are just as confused and curious about this theory and the prospect of its implications on the truth claims of the Mormon Church in and of themselves. Now, I'm not sure exactly how to broach this topic, because this is a huge discussion. And what Cody and I talked about over the past few hours of discussion represents a massive body of research that's going into this. There are a lot of sources that we used, and there are plenty more sources that we did not include that will be included in the show notes. But hopefully this only serves as a jumping off point for more research in this field. Personally, I think that this theory that Joseph may have used entheogens or hallucinogens to facilitate spiritual responses in his parishioners, I think it holds explanatory power, and it's very simple, and Joseph had access to these chemicals, to these hallucinogens, and he may have been learning from people, mentors like Lumen Walters or Samuel Lawrence, how to use these. Being an amateur that he was, it's understandable that he may have tried a few different concoctions until he finally got it down right, which culminated in the 1836 Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony. Now, that's the crux of this argument, okay? That's the crux of this theory, the one main point that this theory points to and says, how else do you explain that? And Cody and I discussed this briefly, but I don't think that a con man will lay things to chance and the power of his own hypnosis. If a con man can use a prop in order to complete a con, I think they'll choose that every time. So, I mean, it's really tough to tell, and all I can say is whether or not this theory is true, it needs to be discussed. And it isn't one of those fringe theories that is just so absurd that it shouldn't even be given a platform. There is enough information here that we need to study it realistically. So hopefully this has only been a jumping off point for further research, for yourselves and myself alike. We have to get to the bottom of this. We have to propose this theory, and if it does hold explanatory power, then let's espouse it. But if it gets shot down, then that's great. At least the public discourse was there. So let's have these discussions, and I'm completely open-minded to whether or not Joseph did use it. I am looking at the evidence that exists as it does, and the accounts from the people that we have, the first-hand accounts from these situations, and I think it makes sense personally. But that's myself, and I'm open-minded to any level of discourse. And of course, Cody is as well, and he gave his email address just for that reason, sillyrabbits, PSILLY.rabbits@gmail.com, because he wants to hone his argument as well. If this theory is becoming more and more prevalent, and if there are holes in the theory, we need to stitch those up, and we need to try and make it as bulletproof as possible if it's going to hold any place in the public discourse of Mormon historianship. So, that being said, that's my opinion. You, the listeners, you formulate your own opinion. That's what this show is for. We look at both sides, or hopefully all sides. We strip away all the biases and we skepticize everything. Come to your own conclusions. Do some more research on this. This is just the beginning. That being said, this is the end of the episode. I hope all of you had a lovely holidays. Thank you so much to all of the listeners for tuning in for this part 2. I just had so much fun with my discussion with Cody. He's an interesting and knowledgeable guy. And of course, he has hinted a little bit at maybe starting up his own podcast, which I think is long overdue. I'd love to have all of this information in a much more palpable format and, have its own platform. I just encourage Cody over the airwaves, man, get that podcast together. People want this information and get it out there. One more thing I needed to add really quickly. I was on the most recent episode of Scathing Atheist, where we discuss this time in Mormon history. Now, this is the third installment of Mormon history on Scathing Atheist. The first installment was Carthage Jail Shootout. The second was Mountain Meadows Massacre. And now the third is talking about the Mormon-Missouri War. So if you want a little bit of a glimpse into what the future of our historical timeline holds, please check out this episode of Scathing Atheist. It is a 2-parter, so you get one part of the second half of this week's episode of Scathing Atheist, of course, is going to be part 1 of it, and the episode that comes out on the 29th, that will be part 2. Of course, there will be links for that in the show notes. That being said, I need to close down the episode, but before I do, I need to thank a few people, as usual. First off, I need to thank Demonista for posting up on the Facebook page. Also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in the show. For his blog, you can check out weirdmormonshit.com. Need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music, this amazing music that's chiming in your ears right now. For his music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com and download it there. I need to thank all of the amazing listeners who support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism and turn this into a full-time endeavor. If you'd like to leave a voicemail to be played at the end of the show, whether it's talking about your story or just something I fucked up on the show, please call in at 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO, and it'll be played on the next episode. Most of all, I need to thank you as studious listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.